What's happening, folks? Geologist Philip Prince with an Appalachian video today talking about ancient impacts. A lot of folks asked for this video in one way or another. And if you just look at the landscape here, you might be able to recognize where we're talking about. I would imagine maybe that a lot of people are not able to because it's something that you don't hear about much. And frankly, that surprises me from a geologic standpoint. I wanted this to be a authentic Appalachian video. So I got the camo and Dr. Enough going on here today. If you look at this place and you recognize it, I'm impressed. And if not, it's Middlesboro, Kentucky, which is conveniently situated next to the Cumberland Gap, this ridge called Rocky Face, and the gap in Pine Mountain there at Pineville. And collectively, all of these features allowed Europeans to spread from the East Coast more into the continental interior in the late colonial period and in the early stages of America as a country. Now, why do you need geology to move across a place like this? Well, if you throw some digital topography on that, you can see it's about as rough of a landscape as you're going to find. That Middlesboro Impact Structure, not going to call it a crater for reasons that will be described in this video, but that impact structure really stands out within that topography. In fact, it's about the flattest piece of land you're going to find anywhere, right next to the Cumberland Gap and Rocky Face there. And if you sort of connect the dots, that's going to be the best way to get across this exceptionally rugged landscape. Try that down there, up there, not going to go so well, particularly in the late 18th century when you don't have internal combustion engines, you're dealing with animals, wagons, things like that. Really, you're going to have to be able to use the landscape to move around in a place like this. And these landforms that we're going to talk about are going to be central to how that happened. If you zoom in even closer, you can get a better look at some of those really crazy rough mountains there that are in between the Pine Mountain and Cumberland Mountain Ridge. And just the thought of trying to move on foot with a simple wheeled vehicle pulled by animals across that, it's not going to go terribly well. And the ability to pass through all of these features in kind of a connect the dots fashion is really sort of a special occurrence. And at the end of the video, talk a little bit about how this might actually be the biggest coincidence in geologic history that I can think of anywhere on planet Earth. So it's kind of a cool story, but I'm going to spend a lot of time just talking about why the land looks like this in the first place and why you would need this big open space here to kind of put everything together and make a better path across this topography. Now, Middlesboro itself is a good example of what that nice impact structure does for the landscape. It's the best place to put a town around there. It would be exceedingly difficult to do any kind of building in the really rugged topography that is in the rough zones on either side of Middlesboro. And if you think about the old route across the topography here, it matches up pretty well with US 25 as it sits today. So this remains the way to travel across this part of the Appalachians. Now, where are we here? This is the if you will outer edge, I guess, of the Appalachian Mountains. I've shown this in a few other videos, but the ancient Appalachians, which again would have looked quite different from what you see today, had the biggest mountains out here over what's today the western Piedmont or maybe the eastern Blue Ridge, and the mountain topography would have tapered out to the north and west toward the interior of the continent. The very outermost expressions of the continental collision that caused parts of the Earth's crust to sort of squeeze up and stack on top of themselves is out here, sort of on the border of Virginia and Kentucky, kind of where Tennessee meets up there in that tri-state area, and we call it the Pine Mountain Thrust Sheet. And the arrow there is pointing to where Middlesboro is. It's right in the middle of that Pine Mountain Thrust Sheet, which sort of represents the outermost obvious example of Appalachian mountain building. And it's a really big, extensive structure, 125 miles long or something like that, about 200 kilometers long from end to end. And if you zoom in closer and start to look at the topographic grain here, you can see the difference between essentially flat-lying layers in the Appalachian Plateau and the somewhat more orderly valley and ridge down here. Got the Pine Mountain Thrust Sheet outline there. Go from down around like Jacksboro, Tennessee, up to about Squire, West Virginia, which I guess is in I guess that's in McDowell County. Up there towards this northeast end, you don't see that much expression of the Pine Mountain thrush heap, but when you're down around Middlesboro, it absolutely dominates the landscape, and the topography associated with it would have been a really big obstacle if you were trying to go from the nice connected valleys over here in the Valley and Ridge out to some bigger valleys in Kentucky that are sort of blocked from you by this really exceptional Cumberland Mountains topography here on the Pine Mountain thrush sheet. So the arrows that you see here, those were the objective. That's what Europeans were hoping to do in the 18th century, to move north and west into different land. But again, that was a tough thing to do, largely for topographic and thus geologic reasons. So when you look at this landscape, again, the roughness kind of just grabs you by the collar. It's not the highest mountains in the Appalachians by any stretch, but just the ruggedness, the number of little stream channels and ravines and hollers and things, as well as these really abrupt ridges, are something that even today is difficult to deal with from the engineering standpoint. And what you're seeing here is geology. Out there in Kentucky, where the layers are flat lying, you have that sort of carved up, dissected, kind of branching network landscape. Tilted layers there on Pine Mountain make that long straight ridge. Got some more flat layers in between the ridges here. Cumberland Mountain's another tilted area. And then out here in the Powell Valley with the Powell River flowing down there from upper right to bottom left, the layers are somewhat folded, but they're pretty close to flat as well. So the landscape here, like much of Appalachia, literally is geology. It is the rock layers. And if you look to the northeast along the trend of the valleys here, there's Middlesboro, and the overall geologic structure is kind of this upward fold in the Powell Valley with the Powell River. Then it dips down through Middlesboro, and it comes back up again on Pine Mountain there. Now, that arched up area, call that an anticline. The flex downward area with Middlesboro, it's a syncline. Then you have, again, that kind of upward thrusting of the layers at Pine Mountain there. That's the framework to this landscape. That's what makes this place rough and set up like it is, and that's what makes it necessary, if you will, to have that big crater in there disrupting everything. So I wanted to illustrate the type of movement that is necessary to fold the layers in this fashion. Again, it was the outermost expression of the collision that was producing the Appalachian Mountains, and it involves pushing layers and causing them to kind of fold and arch in a very specific way. Going to diagram that in paint, and then also we're gonna take that drawing that's produced and expand it a little bit later. So you will see it again, but we'll hop out to paint here and show you what it looks like. Hang on just a minute. Okay, so like any big Appalachian structure, we're going to have to take a sequence of layers here and subject them to compressional stress. That compression is the result of the continental collision that produced all the geologic structures that have been exposed by erosion to frame up the Appalachians as you see them today. Now, the gray stuff at the bottom there, that's continental crust. That's not going to be involved here. We're only interested in these sedimentary layers up above it. They're not colored here. We'll color them in later, and it's going to make things look a little better. But first and foremost, we got to take those sedimentary layers. We're going to push from the right and cause them to stack up and on top of themselves. And that breaking and stacking is going to occur in a very specific way. What I've drawn here is going to be the fault. That's going to be the breakage along which that stacking is going to occur. It comes down and goes flat in a single layer for a long way, and then it steps down into deeper layers again, right? So here we go, pushing from the right. And we're going to push everything up and out, just sort of an arbitrary distance there. I think that's going to be enough to show what we need to show. And push everything up here. End up with something like that. And what's interesting here is where this thicker section of layers has to step up into the shallower part of the fault. It's going to make that big bulge where you're taking that thick area and putting it in a place that is made to accommodate a much thinner one. Likewise, in front of that, the layers are actually going to get flexed downward. And what we got to do here, it's sort of the reason that I started with some pre-drawn layers here, is that now we're going to have to make these adjustments and show what these layers are going to look like now that they've been folded just a little bit here. And overall, the structure that we have made here is called a ramp anticline. I guess the more general term for this would be a fault bend fold. And the reason it's called that is that the fault is bending, and that's what's causing the folding. It's a really cool geologic structure and one that is actually world famous. The big hump there on the right, that's that Powell Valley anticline. If you go onto Google right now and type in Powell Valley anticline, you will find no shortage of illustrations, cross sections, published papers, whatever else, simply because that is just sort of the world champion fault bend fold or ramp anticline structure. It's easy to study it here in the vicinity of the Cumberland Gap, just because the erosion has laid it bare so nicely. And I got to pay special attention to what I'm cleaning up right now because that's about to be Pine Mountain. Kind of the future of all of this is that erosion's going to have to come along and sculpt these now folded layers into the landscape that you see today. And when I say erosion, I mean quite a lot of it. There never was, of course, like this big thing sticking up out of the ground like this. That's just using an illustrative convention here to show you how far the stuff's moved. But suffice it to say, quite literally, the landscape you see today, the mountains, have been etched out by the removal of thousands of feet or kilometers of overlying rock. I'm going to erode this landscape that I've drawn down into sort of a skyline that's going to look more like this with Pine Mountain, some even higher mountains, Cumberland Mountain, and then the Powell Valley. The Powell Valley is associated with the anticline, and ironically, the high mountains are associated with the place where the rocks have been folded downward, which shows you how important erosion has been in producing the mountains you see today. All right. This erosional part is going to be boring to watch. I'm not even going to play it in fast forward. It's going to get clipped out. I'm going to get it squared away here. Be back with you in just a minute, and we'll talk about how the landscape is actually developed and how the landscape is firmly tied to these rock layers. So hang on just a minute. Okay, so added some colors here, removed a lot of material due to erosion, but we're talking hundreds of millions of years of erosion and a landscape that is just sort of the roots almost of the geologic structures that we illustrated there initially. So what would this look like if you turn it into a landscape? Well, you're going to have Pine Mountain there, Cumberland Mountain there, what you would call the Cumberland Mountains in between the two ridges, which is an area of incredibly rough topography and actually the highest point in the state of Kentucky. It sits in the part of the structure that's actually folded downward. So that shows you just how much erosion has done to sculpt the landscape. Actually, the structural lows are now topographic highs. And if we were to start to fill this in as topography, we'll make our Pine Mountain Ridge here. And when we get back to the maps, we want to talk a little bit more about the transition from that older kind of Appalachians are still growing landscape to what you see today. So that would be the Cumberland Mountain Ridge. Out here in the Powell Valley, you might see just a little bit of topography here and there, but mostly you aren't really going to see any evidence of kind of ridges or anything out there because the layering is quite flat. And that's sort of an unusual thing to see within that purple layer within the Appalachians. Maybe down here where this brownish layers at the surface, you might get kind of a little bit of foothills down there below the Cumberland Mountain Ridge, which indeed is something that you can see in LiDAR. The sedimentary section where it is upturned there is absolutely beautiful, and you can see it with exceptional detail. What's going to be in between those two ridges? Well, that's where we have that kind of rugged Appalachian plateau style topography where everywhere you look, there's kind of another river system kind of snaking off in another direction. Absolutely impenetrable from the standpoint of exploration and folks trying to kind of find their easiest path across these mountain ridges. So having features like Cumberland Gap and the Middlesboro crater and the rocky face structure kind of all linked up together is an absolutely incredible asset for westward expansion. Now, what's out here just past Pine Mountain, well, it's going to be more of the same. It's more of that Appalachian Plateau style topography, and I'll try to kind of give myself a few of these drainages to kind of build my scribble scrabbles off of here. But all I'm trying to show at this sort of zoomed out scale is just the ruggedness of that topography, and how these landscapes are very much a product of the kind of rocks exposed underneath them. And in the Appalachians, particularly, how those rock layers are actually tilted. Flat lying layers, particularly when there's some sandstone and shale involved, as you see here, going to make just topographic chaos, the classic world famous Appalachian Plateau. But if you tilt those layers just a little bit, you're going to end up with these nice orderly ridges, right? Now, where's the crater in all of this? Well, let's put that on here. It would be, I don't know, we'll knock some ridge out of here. The crater would be developed something like this, and I shouldn't even call it a crater. I'm going to call it the structure, because there again has been so much erosion on the landscape since it happened. So it would have hit right about there. And the big question is, to me anyway, as a geologist, whether that happened before or after the kind of the thrust faulting process here. And I'm going to talk about that at the end of the video. But one way or another, it is affecting those flat lying layers. Those are the ones that are the hardest to get across. And what we need to throw in as kind of the final touch here would be that rocky face structure, which is going to be an unusually kind of orderly ridge, again cutting through. So there's going to be our impact structure right there, an unusually orderly ridge that's going to be cutting through what is otherwise chaos. Now, final icing on the cake here. Why is there a Cumberland Gap in the ridge right next to the crater? If we zoom in really, really close here, there's actually a repetition in the rock layers here. So it would be something like stacking that brown layer, or the brick red layer, I guess, kind of like on top of itself like that. And in fact, probably you probably even need just a little bit of the straw layer on top of that as well. And this is just kind of shooting from the hip here. And that's gonna, as you can see here, you kind of have to like jog and adjust everything just a little bit. And just that kind of faint irregularity in the pattern of that ridge, as well as the fact that you got this rocky face structure intersecting there, that's what's going to make just enough of an irregularity in the topography that you're going to be able to produce an eroded gap in the ridge that people are going to be able to use to get across the mountains there. So key point again, erosion. What you see today is the product of removal of a huge amount of rock. And the biggest mountains today are where the rock is the least erodible. Likewise, the gaps in the low areas have formed where the rock is the most erodible, right? So we'll hop back to the maps here. I'm going to play with these drawings just a little bit more to try to give you a sense of what the land was set up like when the impact would have occurred, which was with thousands of feet more rock on the landscape, and then just show the transition into what you're looking at here today, because it's really different. And among other things, the mountains today are absolutely tiny in terms of the overall scale of the geologic structures. We don't know how big the mountains were here in the past. This is the outer parts of the Appalachians. The biggest mountains weren't here, but they were probably larger than what you see today. The structures that supported those mountains were a whole lot larger than what you see today. So it's an interesting way to look at geology here in the Appalachians, right? So back to the maps. We'll keep rolling. Okay, so there you go. That's the formation of the up, the down, the up that defines this part of Appalachia. And if you sort of animate that, watch it moving, there's the push and the associated folding. and then you erode that down to get the modern landscapes. You got the Cumberland Gap there. That's on Cumberland Mountain, obviously, where there's a little bit of structural irregularity that I talked about. That makes the rock a little bit more erodible. That's why there's a gap there. That connects up very nicely with the rocky face ridge that's coming across that syncline where the layers are flexed downward a little bit. There you got what I've called the crater there. And again, I should call it an impact structure because this thing wasn't anywhere near the land surface when the rock was damaged enough to have eroded and look like it does today. There's Rocky Face, and then you'd have Pine Mountain out here at the edge, right? So what I wanted to do, I was having fun drawing this stuff actually, is I wanted to take that movement and expand it into a bigger kind of ancient landscape to give you a sense of where the impact would occurred and what it would have looked like. So to have this kind of older Appalachia, you got to put a lot of rock back on it. I've also expanded this out into the valley and ridge of today, closer to what would have been sort of the core of the mountains. So ancient landscape here, a lot more rock, literally thousands of feet, as much as 10,000 feet, maybe more. So you're talking on the order of 2.5, 3 kilometers, maybe something like that. A very different expression of mountains, I guess, from what we have today. But that's where the impact would have occurred, right? It would have occurred out here, sort of ahead of the valley and ridge in that kind of downward flexed area. And that impact would have occurred onto a land surface that would have been separated, I guess, from the modern land surface by thousands of feet of rock. Now, it wouldn't have been that much higher when the Appalachians were fully assembled. The Earth's crust was actually kind of weighed down from all of these stacked sequences of rock. But the rock you see today in Middlesboro was, again, certainly over a mile and a half, so maybe upwards of like 2.5, 3 kilometers below the surface. Nobody knows for sure, but when the impact occurred on the surface, it damaged the rock down underneath it to a considerable depth. And when erosion comes along, it's still encountering that damaged rock from the initial impact, and that's what's allowing that kind of circular landform to develop. So it's a question of rock erodibility more than it actually is an impact crater. So that's why you would call it an impact structure. And combined with all of these other landforms, that gives you the modern day layout here that is very different in terms of the surface expression of the rock types, what they form in terms of topography, and just how much rock there is here within this sequence of stacked sedimentary layers. So there's the impact structure, Pine Mountain, Cumberland Mountain, got the Powell River there, and you can see Rocky Face there that's cutting across that downward flexed area and sort of linking the gap, the impact structure, and a linear valley so that you can get out through Pine Mountain there. That's going to be that route, and it's almost like, yeah, it's kind of coincidental that all of these things happen to sit in the right place here, right? So if you zoom in on it, catch a little bit more detail there. The crater, shouldn't call it crater, structure, you get in the habit. I don't know. The structure sits on top of recognizable rock, but the rock is really like damaged and messed up. I've actually driven through Middlesboro here, and I think on some of the cuts behind buildings here along 25, you can see kind of damaged and broken up sedimentary rock. The layering is there, but it's been very much altered. This has been studied at length, and it is absolutely 100% impact related. Nobody knows for sure how deep under the surface these rocks were when the impact occurred, but it would have been quite a ways. And again, as I said, we're just seeing the damage from it today, making the landscape erode much more easily here. And otherwise in this area, the layering is quite clean, and it's really beautifully expressed on the mountains. I've kind of drawn these little triangles here on Pine Mountain. These are flat irons. We'll look at those in just a minute, but they are just one expression of how this layered geology here and the geologic structure creates such an incredibly rough, jagged landscape. into which you have to introduce these kind of special features to give folks a way to get across it there. That's the kind of view I'm trying to illustrate there. So worked out all right. I have a lot of fun cooking this stuff up in paint here. Powell Valley, Middlesboro Syncline, Cumberland Mountain, Pine Mountain, and just that overall kind of grain and style of the landscape, like we said, is very much a direct product of geology. Now, in terms of the rock here making this impassable topography, it would be like, well, if these folks were that anxious to get across the mountains, why didn't they just, kind of carve a path at a grade up the side of one of the mountains? You just can't do it. It's incredibly rocky. These mountains are actually upturned sequences of sandstone. And if you look at it with LiDAR, it looks almost like these kind of like stacked scales or something like that. This is on Pine Mountain. I've turned it around here to look southwest, but that stacked scale look is actually sandstone layers, and they've been eroded here by channels. They turn into those triangles we call flat irons, but those are really, really tough rock, like really, really tough rock. Incredibly difficult to work with, even with mechanized power tools, right? So in the 18th century, it's just not going to happen. Can't really tell that without LiDAR. Interesting way to look at the landscape, and of course something that I make a lot of use of in these videos. This on the Cumberland mountainside, and it's really even worse over here. That really exaggerated exposure of those sandstone layers and the grain that it gives this mountain range here is just really something else. There's not a road up that here today, essentially for the same reason that there wouldn't have been in the 18th century. It's just almost too rough to mess with, right? Again, without that LiDAR, you don't get a sense of that. But if you were there on the ground walking over it and trying to go kind of straight up the face of the mountain there, oh yes, that would become very apparent to you. And when you mix those ridges in with the more flat-lying layers that are kind of right here in the middle of the downturn area, it turns into just about one of the roughest landscapes that you're going to find anywhere. Again, it's not rough in terms of overall height of mountains or even overall topographic relief. It's just the amount of relief or the amount of slope. The entire landscape is steep everywhere you look, and there's just not a good through going easy way to make your way through here. And that's why you got to have something completely external here to kind of shake things up a little bit and provide a way to get through all of this crazy rough topography that is actually just sort of the structural geology poking out at the surface, right? So without the Middlesboro structure here, without erosion producing this really pronounced big flat area that just happens to be right next to Cumberland Gap and Rocky Face and this gap at Pineville up here, the way to get across this landscape would just look really, really different. In fact, I don't even know what it would look like, and I guess people would have had to have gone down towards Jacksboro or even further down southwest, down into Alabama or something like that. I don't know. Really a one of a kind relationship of all of these structures that just happen to make everything just kind of work out perfectly. So, is this geology's greatest coincidence? I mentioned that earlier. Probably should have called the video that, I guess. What I mean by that is, did that crater structure happen to form right next to the gap? Is that just like good luck, or did the Cumberland Gap, Rocky Face, and the Pineville Gap, sort of these related structures, are they actually in some way the result of the impact kind of joggling the rocks up before they got crunched and folded and thrust faulted? I don't know the answer to that. The accepted belief within the literature is that the impact occurred after the squeezing, after the folding and thrust faulting. People have studied this quite a bit, and that seems to be an absolute consensus. If you showed me that landscape and that pattern of ridges and everything, just thinking about how Earth's fold thrust belts work, I would have told you that something like this happened. You got the impact going on there. It leaves this big disturbed area in the rock. And then when you have the crunching there, that disturbed area is actually what produces the slightly irregular faulting and folding that end up producing the Cumberland Gap and Rocky Face and the Pineville Gap. So, in other words, those irregular structures would have been a result of the impact kind of damaging the rock mass. Again, it is widely accepted that that is not the case. Sort of the consensus is that what you see today with that nice path across the mountains would have been something like this, where the structures developed and were already in place and present, and then the impact occurred just in the right place. And then you erode that down. You have the modern day landscape, and it is quite literally a case of the universe having really good aim or something like that. That impact just happened to occur in exactly the right spot. And to me, whew, that's quite a coincidence. I don't know. That's I would be interested to learn more about what the structural geology looks like here, and whether or not there is a chance that the impact damaged the rock prior to the folding and thrust faulting, because it seems to be almost too much of a coincidence that that the impact could occur just exactly in the right place. But regardless of when it happened, uh, without its occurrence, the landscape here probably would have remained prohibitively rough. There would have been a Cumberland Gap there. There would have been a Rocky Face, but I think it's unlikely, and I think folks have said that it's unlikely that that would have been an appealing enough way to actually cross Cumberland Mountain, the rough topography in the middle, and then Pine Mountain to get out into more into the continental interior. So one way or another, that impact and the structure got at that time that is still there today from the damage to the rock was absolutely key, really in kind of shaping American history. So it's kind of a cool relationship. I've studied a lot of geology over the years, and I don't think that ever came up once. It wasn't until I was sort of past school, actually past teaching everything else, that I started running across this. So it's an interesting case of structural geology, impact geology, long-term erosion, and maybe things just happening in the right place at the right time. Hope you enjoyed this video. Probably going to keep going on the Appalachian thing, and hope you'll check out the next one.